Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the newly released What Works Clearinghouse Practice Guide on providing reading interventions for students in grades 4 through 9. This webinar is being recorded. A link to view the recorded webinar will be shared via email to all attendees who registered for this webinar. The recording will also be available on the IES What Works Clearinghouse YouTube channel later today. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of the meeting to answer questions that were submitted via the registration form. This slide lists the 7 panel members who provided support for this practice guide. Our presenters today include our panel chair, Sharon Vaughn, from the University of Texas at Austin, and practitioner Kim St. Martin from the MTSS TA Center with the Michigan Department of Education. I will now pass it on to Russell Gersten, the Executive Director of Instructional Research Group and Principal Investigator for this practice guide. Russell?
Hi, good afternoon. And this is, first of all, I want to mention this is a product of the What Works Clearinghouse, which many of you have heard of, or you should have heard of. And as the graphic shows, the Clearinghouse has 4 sets of products. The first are the practice guides, and these have been incredibly successful products in terms of the education community. And they look at all the areas you can see above, which is the whole spectrum of education, basically, from literacy to English learners to graduation paths, etc. The second set of products are intervention reports, and these describe the research, the findings, and they're analyzed and rigorously reviewed on interventions. And these can be both commercial programs that are currently in use in schools and interventions developed by researchers. The third type of product is reviews, external reviews of individual studies. And these tend to be studies of pretty considered of importance, national importance on some policy issue or some important instructional issue. And the last part, which is relatively new and ties in with the IES's interest in open science and the current SEER standards, is the data from the study reviews. So it will be public. So if there is an evaluation report of a program called Pathways to Literacy, we will talk about each study that was reviewed. And by we, I mean the whole clearinghouse team of hundreds and hundreds of people will provide that actual evidence, strengths and weaknesses, what data was used and deemed accessible. So it will be for public interest and scrutiny. And that is a big change. Let's go to the next one, Sam. In terms of who might find this guide useful, our sense is any kind of educator involved in any kind of educator involved in reading intervention. So those could be those who oversee MTSS and reading. Some schools have literacy coaches. Sometimes it could be the vice principal in a middle school in charge of instruction and intervention. Special educators, teachers, intervention teachers, reading teachers in middle school, classroom teachers in elementary grades, coaches, trained volunteers. All and any of these would find this of interest. School district, state personnel, hopefully will see this as something to think about as they adopt or develop approved lists or recommend types of intervention curricula or approaches or software or professional development for the faculty. And we think this will also be of use to parents and caregivers who want to know things that are evidence-based that will help their children if they have reading difficulties. Next. Levels of evidence. You'll see in a second the recommendations in this guide, and we're just going to do a quick preview, the 3 of us. But strong means the evidence is consistent and it comes from more than one place and deals with different populations. Moderate means not quite there. There's some strong evidence that's positive, that's statistically significant or trending in a way that's very positive, but there's something a little off. Maybe all of these studies were just done with one particular ethnic group. Maybe some of these studies have what we call pass with reservations. They're good quality, but there's something a little off. They're not quite trustworthy. Just like if you listen to public radio or websites, they'll sometimes say this study was done in Israel, but we can't overgeneralize. It's a pretty small sample of people. It's only one nation. So that's the kind of thing that might, if there are a couple of those, fit into the moderate category. There's a minimal level of evidence, but that's not the case in this guide. So I'm going to skip it for this afternoon. Let's move on. Here are the 4 recommendations and the big picture of what they talk about. And for those in the field, this will hardly be a surprise, is the importance of teaching students reading decoding skills, is starting at the word level. And the particular stress at this age level is going to be complex multisyllabic words. And we provide a reasonable amount of detail and direction in how to do that. The next one is building fluency. In order to understand what you read, and you've heard this hundreds of times, it needs to become pretty effortless, so you're actually able to read the text and can start reflecting on what the text is telling you or how the author's trying to engage you in a narrative or a piece of fiction. And we talk in the guide about purposeful fluency building. Third one is routinely use a set of comprehension building practices to help students make sense of text. And this, like the other two, have strong evidence. There's a lot of evidence. I think had we done this 10, 12 years ago, that would not be the case. But there is a lot of evidence now supporting each of these practices for this age group of children. Though one thing to keep in mind in terms of the evidence for comprehension building is that these practices that we're going to spell out, and Sharon and I will do that in just a couple of minutes for each, but they are bundled together in the research. So we can't say with certainty the most important thing is to help students develop gist statements, or the most important thing is for kids to develop their vocabularies and world knowledge. And if you do that, their comprehension is going to go up. These seem right now to be 4 aspects of comprehension building that go in tandem. The last one relates, and there's moderate evidence, it's a newer approach, at least in terms of systematic study, is stretch text, challenging text. It's a complex idea. It's a new one. We've devoted more time in the webinar to that than the others that are more familiar topics to most of you. And now I will turn things over to Kim.
Thank you, Russell. I'm going to provide an overview of the first 2 recommendations that focus on practices to improve students' ability to read words both accurately and automatically. So recommendation 1, multisyllabic word reading, builds students' decoding skills so they can read complex multisyllabic words. The level of evidence for this recommendation is strong. Next slide. There are 4 how-to steps within this recommendation. How-to step 1 is for asking teachers to identify the level of students' word reading skills in the intervention group and teach vowel and consonant letter sounds and combinations as necessary. So related to the first portion of this how-to step, identifying the level of students' word reading skills can help teachers appropriately place students with similar decoding needs into intervention. So some things that teachers can use are things like word reading list or an oral reading fluency measure. The second portion of the first how-to step focuses on using the information gathered from the assessments to provide intervention instruction. So based on the data gathered, some students may need more support in vowel R combinations, ARE, AIR. They may need, as found in the words like unaware or impaired. They may need instruction in trigraphs like DGE or TCH, found in words like dispatched or dislodged. The second how-to step is for teachers to teach students a routine that they can use to decode multisyllabic words. So within this how-to step, we really would recommend that the routine is designed to be flexible enough so it can be used across different types of multisyllabic words. These are words that may or may not have many prefixes or just prefixes, not suffixes. Within this recommendation, we provide 2 examples of instructional routines that can be used. The first being teaching students how to identify prefixes and suffixes and vowel combinations to decode the multisyllabic words. So in the word that I just shared a few moments ago, impaired, students would identify and circle the prefix im, suffix ed, and then they would underline the vowel combination ai. They would loop under each of those parts as they say it, then they would say the whole word and connect the word to a word that they recognize. So in some cases, you may have a student that is sounding out impaired, and they may say impaired, but that's not a word that they may recognize. And they would apply what we refer to as mispronunciation correction. So they would make it a word that they in fact recognize. The second routine that we provide in this recommendation is to support students in identifying syllables within the word and then sounding out the word. So in this routine, the teacher has students underline single vowels, vowel or vowel consonant combinations. The students learn to count the number of the vowel sounds to determine how many syllables are in the word. And then they break the word into parts with every syllable having a vowel sound. And then they blend those parts together to be able to read the word. The third step is asking teachers to embed spelling instruction in the lesson. So we know that embedding spelling instruction in the context of a decoding lesson is good practice. It's going to help students be able to generalize the decoding skills that they were learning. And last but not least, the fourth how-to step is to engage students in a wide array of activities that allow them to practice reading multisyllabic words accurately with increasing automaticity. So the next slide, we provide an example of 10 practice activities that teachers can use to build students' automaticity with word reading skills. We certainly would not recommend that all 10 have to be chosen and embedded into one lesson. We would ask the teachers to be very judicious in thinking about the purpose of the lesson and thinking of the time that's allocated. So next slide. In addition to the how-to steps that we provide for the recommendation, we also provide some potential obstacles and give advice for teachers for how to address the potential obstacles. For the purpose of this overview presentation, Russell and Sharon and I are going to share 1 to 2 examples per recommendation. In this case, for the first recommendation, one of the potential obstacles is a few of my students can read multisyllabic words pretty effortlessly, but they perform poorly on reading tests because of weak vocabulary and difficulty in comprehension. Our advice as a panel is that these students need additional work on language and vocabulary development. So minimize decoding and fluency instruction and instead maximize comprehension instruction. We suggest things like considering grouping students in an intervention that does focus on oral language and reading comprehension, and which you're going to hear about in a few moments from my colleagues, Russell and Sharon. The activities that are done in the comprehension intervention should expand both world and word knowledge while giving students opportunities to have meaningful discussions about the text that they're reading. And so you're going to hear more in recommendation 3 and 4. Sam, next slide. Now for the second recommendation, fluency building. Provide purposeful fluency building activities to help students read effortlessly. The level of evidence for this recommendation is strong. Next slide. So within this recommendation, there are 3 how-to steps. These steps can be accomplished in a variety of ways. Teachers can have students reading in pairs. They can be reading aloud as a group. They can be reading to themselves and sharing with partners. But the first step of this recommendation is for teachers to provide a purpose for each repeated reading. So the panel recommends that students reread the same passage approximately 3 to 4 times. However, each time that they're reading, we're recommending that they read with a different purpose. So as educators, the purpose for rereading text can be determined based on students' needs. Here's an example. So if a teacher has students that are working on word reading skills, one of the purposes for reading could be to identify multisyllabic words for the purpose of improving their reading accuracy, their word reading accuracy. Another purpose that a teacher may use is to have students answering questions about the text that they're reading. Within this recommendation, we provide 3 examples to help teachers see how this particular step of providing a different purpose for reading can be accomplished. The second step is to focus some instructional time on reading with prosody. Knowing when to pause, knowing which words to emphasize, and the tempo of reading can also help students understand or comprehend what it is that they're reading. The third step is for teachers to regularly provide opportunities for students to read a wide range of text. So historically, there have been some limitations with using repeated readings to build fluency. When students are being asked to read the same passage again and again and again. So this particular how-to step is designed to counteract this limitation. And we're recommending that students be exposed to a range of text. And those texts should have different sentence structures, like simple, compound, complex sentences. They should be of a range of new topics and should expose students to a variety of new words. Next slide. One of the potential obstacles that you can find within this recommendation is it's hard to find materials that include the words or the patterns the students are learning, relate to subject area topics, or are age appropriate and increase in difficulty. So our advice as a panel is to look at published curriculum resources that are already accessible to the teachers that are within the schools. Since many of those curriculum resources do include words and passages from different sources. However, if published materials don't exist or they're not available to teachers, then words and passages can be selected from a variety of things that the teachers already have access to. So things like textbooks, novels, newspapers. Those are all some examples of things that teachers can access. We also would suggest scheduling time for teachers to do this work together. This would certainly be helpful to be able to help the teachers find materials that they can use, and using existing meeting times like grade level team meetings or department or cross-department team meetings can help to embed this into existing structures. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Russell.
We're at Comprehension Building, which has a strong level of evidence. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, though, it does not mean that every single component, and this is by far the lengthiest segment because this is the critical kind of thing. This is ultimately what you're leaving children with, before they go into high school, is basically being able to read with understanding, being able to make sense of a textbook so they can study and do well in an exam in whatever content classes they're taking. Next step. The 3 pieces of this, and we put this into 4 bins. We could have put it into probably 6 or 7, but these seem the critical things where most studies fit. They had components in at least several of these. The first one is building world and word knowledge, and so that they can make sense of the text that they're reading that day. And Sam, if you can flip to the next slide for just a second. Next one, the visual one. Yeah. This is an example of the kind of way that very quickly, before students are reading something in a science book on ecosystems, you can kind of give them some background knowledge quickly, efficiently. This comes from the Meadows Center. There are numerous websites. You can just Google anything from rainforests, find a visual or two that works. Videos work very well, but the whole way is to very briefly have kids immersed here. For example, if you were doing what's American history, the 20th century American history, the Battle of Stalingrad, rather than just reading about it, if kids saw a 2-minute clip of what it was like, the kind of slaughter that went on there, many of them then may raise the issue. This seems a little bit like what we're seeing about what's going on in Eastern Ukraine now, which is fine. It's getting them going. It's also motivating them for reading what they're going to read about in the Battle of Stalingrad. And let's go back one, Sam. Okay. The other thing is word knowledge, that it is not getting through the often lengthy vocabulary lists in the books, and they'll tend to emphasize words unique that are technical words for science or words that are very specific in history. What your job is in terms of working with these words is to pick a very small set of words that'll be crucial for understanding that day's reading, but also that week's unit, and in a lot of ways for reading other science and history material for the rest of the student's life. So a word like compromise, annihilate, equilibrium, those are words to teach in depth, to have kids use, and to spend time building that kind of thing, because you're building, and for English learners, you're building, in all students, you're building academic language. But the idea is to do that, to teach those words that are essential. And tied into that, and it's going to always be hard to pick because so many of them seem important, is 3 that are familiar. And this is the sense the panel had. Many of these will be strategies for making sense of vocabulary that children have been exposed to in their core instruction. Deriving meanings of unknown words using context. There probably were exercises in their course series when they were younger on this. Prefixes and suffixes, are again commonly taught, what anti means, that kind of thing. Some of the Greek and Latin roots are often covered, but it doesn't mean these students know how to use them. So what the job of an intervention is to really hone in and model for students and practice with them and reinforce them when they're using these, and prompt them while they're reading how, hey Jorge, this is a time where we can use the context to help us figure out the meaning of this word. So the whole idea here is to hone in on these things that students may have been previously exposed to. And now we can skip on go forward to. Here's the obstacle for this one that comes up all the time, and it is really difficult, is you look at the words that many of your students don't know in this history passage, and the hope is that we go out of our way, especially in intervention, to find at least some material that is more engaging than some of the typical textbook excerpts, which we've looked at in terms of generating examples here, but in any case, there's so many words. So how do you pick them? So you have to be judicious in choosing the words with the long shelf life for the kids and that are crucial to understanding. Like, for example, if it's leading up to the Civil War, the word compromise comes up again and again, and what is gained and what is lost in the numerous compromises that were crafted for short periods of time. What about other words that the kids don't know? Well, if it's a barrier to understanding, like let's say right now you figure autocrat comes up, but it just comes up this one day and then it's not going to keep coming up. Just tell them what it means. Just tell them quickly what it means. Also, always allow children a chance to say, teach, I don't know what a plutocracy is or an oligarchy is or something. Just let them ask and give them a quick answer. And then, of course, teaching students to use dictionaries and thesauruses is important, but it is no substitute for the in-depth vocabulary instruction that we'd like to see in interventions. And let's go to the next one, Sam. The next one is asking and answering questions. Good readers ask themselves questions as they read. It's almost semi-automatic with most of us. It's like, wait a minute, why is he suddenly creating this alliance with somebody from the other political party? I don't understand this. And then often you go back with that question in mind and read. But the thing is, how do you build that skill in these children, many of whom do see, and I think all three of us have taught students like this, reading is a chore to get out of the way as quickly as possible. So how do you transform these students? Well, the first way is working with children on ways to answer questions, because there are always going to be questions in their science class, in their ELA class, and in any class. They're going to be asked to read things or have things read to them even and answer questions. So systematic work on finding the answers to the questions in the text, starting with more literal questions, moving out to those that there are a couple of pieces in the text. You got to put two pieces together. One's in the first paragraph, one's in the second. This is where genuine, rich, explicit instruction comes in, where you're modeling. Then you're half modeling for children, but then there you say, well, let's look at paragraph 3, because there's something here that's going to help me answer this question. So I look for these 2 pieces of information so I can answer. I don't give up if I don't find it in one sentence. That's the kind of thing to start with. The other thing with answering is having kids work together as teams, and even in small groups. And we know in interventions, sometimes there'll be small groups, and sometimes it'll be a reading class that might have 15 or 20 children. In any case, having them work in pairs is good. And the last one is teaching them to ask themselves questions while they read, and that requires modeling, but then right away having kids practice doing that. And I think I am done, and we'll turn things over to Sharon.
Thank you, Russell. That's great. And thank you, Kim. I'm continuing on the comprehension for understanding. And Russell presented recommendations 1 and 2, and I'm going to present recommendation 3 and 4. And recommendation 3 is to teach students a routine for determining the gist or the main idea of a short section of text. And for this recommendation, there are 3 how-to steps. The first how-to step is to model, that is, the teacher or educator models how to use an instructional routine so that students know how to generate gist statements. So rather than just asking the question, what is the main idea or what is the gist, practices for specifically teaching students how to think about what the gist is or main idea are modeled and demonstrated by the teacher. The second how-to step is to teach students how to use text structures to generate gist statements. And these text structures often vary by discipline, that is social studies, science, and English language arts, have a variety of text structures. And understanding these text structures promotes students' success at being able to generate main idea. The third how-to step is to work collaboratively with students to generate gist statements, much like with question generation that Russell presented earlier, providing students with opportunities to work in pairs or small groups in which they co-build main idea or gist statements, identifying the critical who or what that the text is about, and also identifying critical ideas related to that so that the gist or main idea is collaboratively built in usually not too many words. A gist or main idea is not thought of as another way to write the paragraph, but a brief version in which students summarize in their own words what that paragraph or piece of text is about. So with respect to this recommendation, we identify an obstacle like we have for the other recommendations. And the obstacle we're going to identify just for this presentation, there are others that are really very helpful in the guide, focuses on the fact that many students get tired of generating gist statements. So for example, if you are working on getting students to understand main idea or gist, and you utilize this practice day after day, teachers have observed that students get very fatigued and they lose their engagement about the process. We suggest as a panel that you might include a variety of activities. So after you spend several weeks on main idea or gist, you might want to spend some time primarily learning how to do a gist statement on other areas of comprehension. So you focus maybe more on word knowledge or asking and answering questions. You might think of this as taking a little bit of a vacation from generating gist statements or main idea, knowing that you'll come back to it and hopefully students will be fresher as they think about how to do it. Another obstacle that you might have encountered or teachers encounter is that sometimes I think my students have finally learned how to generate gist statements. But then a few days later, we get to a new place or a new piece of reading material, and it seems to fall apart. Will they ever learn how to do it and to maintain it and to generalize it? I think this idea of students losing retention of something we think they know how to do is prevailing. So consider this. As texts get more difficult or students encounter unfamiliar topics, generating gist statements might become more challenging for them. So they may need more support. You may need to go back and do more modeling and more scaffolding, or perhaps more peer pairing and discussion. Students may also have trouble with a harder text when they do not have enough world knowledge and/or word knowledge. So I refer you back to the practice we talked about earlier about building essential words and also building essential world knowledge so that when students approach this harder text, generating gists or main ideas is more facile for them. Also continue to ask students to generate gist statements so they continue to work with a skill with harder and harder texts. So students may start with perhaps narrative text or perhaps a hybrid text like biography, and then move to more challenging texts, either because of the complexity of the text type or the difficulty in terms of the reading level. Recommendation Part D under Comprehension Understanding is to teach students to monitor their comprehension as they read. In other words, to think about what they understand, think about what is confusing, sort of monitoring this, saying what's going on, what's happening while they're reading. We think of this as having 3 steps. Step number 1 is to help students determine when they do not understand the text. So it is possible that students who have had reading difficulties for quite a while have learned to be confused. And so we need to help them think about the fact that understanding text is the expectation. And when that doesn't occur, we want to sort of keep track of that. Number 2, we want to teach students to ask themselves questions. Russell referred to that earlier, question asking and question generating, as they read, to check their understanding and to figure out what the text is about. So if you say to yourself, what's happening, what's going on here, and how does this relate to what I read previously? How-to step number 3 is to provide opportunities for students to reflect on what they've learned. Again, this kind of reflection can occur with a group or class as a whole. It can occur in small groups or with pairs. Reflection can also occur through writing. What's a possible obstacle? One possible obstacle is my students are reticent to share what they did not understand, particularly with this age group. Not being willing to say what you don't know may be a common response from students. Helping students feel comfortable sharing when they're not understanding what they're reading may take time. And some of the things that might help, including modeling that yourself, bringing in things that you don't understand, as well as celebrating when students acknowledge that they are having difficulty understanding. Acknowledging that that's an important first step in building understanding is recognizing when you're confused. Some students may not feel comfortable. They may want to hide their confusion, or they may not be accustomed to identifying when they are stuck. So again, teachers can model that and also have other students model how you work from confusion, which is an important first step to recognizing and then moving forward. Repeatedly and encouraging students to share when they need help and remind them that you are there to provide that help. Another obstacle is I keep stopping every 2 minutes to make sure they're understanding what they read. This does not seem to be working so well. It can be hard to follow along with the text if the person reading the text, or if you're reading it silently, if someone stops often. If this technique is not working, don't interrupt their reading after short periods of text, but instead wait and have those pauses occur after longer sections of text. Ask students to continue to mark, underline, or highlight problem areas in the text as they read and share what they marked or their stopping points as you move into longer sections of text. The 4th recommendation from the guide is stretch text. And that recommendation is to provide students with opportunities to practice making sense of stretch text. For example, challenging text, harder text, that will expose them to a more complex set of ideas and information. Unlike the previous 3 recommendations, the recommendation level of evidence for recommendation 4 is moderate. We consider that there are 3 how-to steps that go with providing students with opportunities to practice this making sense of harder, challenging text referred to as stretch text. How-to step number 1 is to prepare for the lesson by carefully selecting appropriate stretch texts. And that is to choose texts in which you have points to stop for discussion and clarification, knowing that students will need to have this more challenging text scaffolded. You may also want to identify essential words and difficult words for students to read, so that when they read the stretch text, these words have already been understood and they can both read them and know their meaning. How-to step number 2 is to provide significant support as the group works through a stretched text together. So rather than asking students initially to use these stretched texts or challenging texts independently, you may want to have students work through them in a small group or in pairs, knowing that students can collaborate on building knowledge and word reading as they move through this difficult text. How-to step number 3 is after students demonstrate comfort with reading stretched texts with a group or with pairs, provide students with electronic supports to use when independently reading stretched text. This could potentially assist them with the pronunciation of some difficult words and can also give them access to technology that will provide them with the word meanings. This use of both independent, small group, and pairs to promote reading stretched texts will allow students to become increasingly comfortable with reading these more difficult or challenging texts. So consider texts that are at the upper range or somewhat above the upper range of students' independent reading level when you're preparing for the lesson. Sequence the stretched text so that the difficult and the passage length, so both the difficulty or challenge of the text as well as how long the text is, gradually increases. You don't want to make very big jumps until students feel increasingly comfortable with the length of the passage or the difficulty of the passage. Choose texts related to topics students are studying in their subject area classes. This co-building of background knowledge, essential words, and word reading by having the stretched text align with the learnings in the classroom around their content learning, rather than isolated passages or excerpts from subject area textbooks. Another example is for looking for texts that are engaging and that discuss interesting ideas or perspectives. So it could be that the topic that they're studying, either in social studies or history or science, is one in which there's an interesting individual or idea that can be looked at in more depth. Before the lesson begins, read through the text to choose sensible and logical points to stop for group discussion. Remember, we gave an example earlier where you don't want to stop so often that students kind of lose the sense of meaning. But you do want to stop to make sure students don't get so lost in the text that they lose the sense of meaning. Create a list of difficult multisyllable words, proper nouns, and essential words to discuss briefly both before and during reading to make sure that these word meanings and the background knowledge are an integral part of learning. Teachers can prepare to read a short section, for example, from grade level text, and they can stop after paragraphs. And these kinds of examples allow teachers to support students in accessing challenging text. Teachers can also prepare to read a short section from a grade level text about a novelist, for example. The teacher can identify some of the proper nouns, for example, Pulitzer Prize, or the name of the author, or the name of the group, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or Native American. Those would be some examples of proper nouns that would be important to think about before reading challenging text. Also, the teacher might think about multisyllabic words using previously taught words. So for example, the teacher might think about frequently, or reservation, or attended, or assimilate. These are words that would be important for students to practice some of the multisyllabic word reading practices that Kim talked about earlier. Also, as Russell referred to, essential words can help students build understanding in more challenging texts, such as novel, reservation, assimilate, or boarding school. Next. How-to step number 2. Teachers can work through stretched text as a group, and rather than assigning stretched text to students independently. Before reading, they can help students understand that stretched text activities are going to sometimes be difficult. We know that when you read this kind of challenging text, it's hard, it's laborious, and we have to kind of bring our best game to reading that text. We want to explain to them that all readers, including us, Read materials that have words that are difficult to read or understand, and sometimes about topics that we don't always have the relevant background knowledge. And we have to work a little harder and use some of our instructional practices or routines that we talked about earlier to help us understand this text. Next. We also need to explain and also remind them that just like everyone learning to do something difficult, whether you're an athlete or whether you're learning to play an instrument, whatever challenging thing you're learning to do, we often don't always stay at an easy or read, as in this case, readable level. Sometimes we need to challenge ourselves in order to build our skills. And we can also explain that the goal is to keep trying to make sense of challenging text together. So we develop habits of sticking with difficult text and not giving up. After students learn to demonstrate a little more comfort with reading stretched text and get a little more used to the idea that working hard and bringing some of these practices to these stretched texts, they might be able to take advantage of the pronunciation of difficult words and word meanings. They will be able to, over time, demonstrate comfort in working with stretched text. And we know that many of these devices, such as electronic dictionaries, can be useful in supporting students. Next. So what are some of the obstacles? Well, there will be many, and we identify a few. Stretched text may be frustrating for students, and some students may give up too easily. So we may need to remind them that it is challenging, but it's just one part of the lesson, and they're going to be supported and guided in ways that will allow it to be accessible. Perhaps work with very brief segments of text, maybe even with just a couple of sentences, and then building up to larger segments of text. Engaging students prior to reading by reminding them that text is difficult, but they will be able to read it over time, and they will see improvements with practice. So I think we're finished with the stretched text, and we can turn it over to questions.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Kim and Russell. We will now answer a handful of questions that were submitted via the registration form. The first question is for Sharon. To what extent do the recommendations from this practice guide apply to students with disabilities? Sharon?
Oh, thank you for that question. I think it's an important one. So before I give the answer, I would like to say that I know that when we refer to students with disabilities, one of the first things we're going to want to do is take a look at the student's individualized education plan, their IEP, and look at what their goals and objectives are and the set of instructional practices there, and to keep those in mind as we determine which and how many of the practices in the practice guide are appropriate. But we think that many of these practices in the practice guide will be quite useful for individuals with disabilities for whom reading comprehension is their goal.
Thank you, Sharon. The next question is for Kim. Please discuss the role of reliable and valid screening assessments. Kim?
Yeah, teachers absolutely should have access to assessments that are designed to measure what they're supposed to measure. And this information, the data that are being collected, should be an accurate reflection of the student's reading skills. It should be used to inform intervention placement, whether or not the need for intervention is there, the scope of instruction. So for example, whether or not students need decoding skills or need intervention instruction on oral language comprehension. We also know that intervention time is limited, especially in the secondary setting. And so being guided by data to make these decisions in order to align the instruction to students' needs is going to be very important. And frankly, it's going to increase the likelihood of the intervention's effectiveness. There are assessment-related resources that are available to support districts in making good screening selection decisions, screening assessment selection decisions. So the National Center for Intensive Intervention, NCII, has the academic tools screening chart, and it contains information that summarizes information that has been submitted by a variety of assessment publishers, information like the technical standards for the assessments, the usability of the assessments, et cetera.
Thank you, Kim. The next question is for Sharon. Could the recommendations from this practice guide be used for core instruction as well as intervention?
Yeah, that's another really good question. We think that many of these practices are designed for comprehension building. And in what we think of as the core classroom, or maybe some people might refer to it as the tier 1 instruction, we know that there will be students in those classes who need support for their reading for understanding or for reading comprehension. And we think many of these practices are ones that will be useful for teachers as they think about the students in their class and think about how they can help build word reading, fluency, and comprehension.
Thank you, Sharon. The next question is for Kim. What is the best source of text to practice decoding multisyllabic words?
This is a good question as well, one that we get asked often. I certainly get asked often. So it is important to have sentences, paragraphs, passages that do in fact contain consonant and vowel combinations, prefixes and suffixes that were the focus of instruction. This gives students a chance to generalize the decoding skills that they were learning to connected text. Both of the strategies that we shared in recommendation 1, the flexible strategy for reading multisyllabic words, they were intentionally designed to be flexible enough to apply to a variety of multisyllabic words that can be found in a variety of texts that students are encountering in classes, etc.
Thank you, Kim. And our last question is for Sharon. What is the best way to engage students with reading difficulties with the comprehension practices suggested?
Oh boy, student engagement is a critical consideration as we think about getting students to participate, practice, and benefit from the great instructional practices that are represented in this guide. One of the things that we can think about as we think about engagement is we want to be sure that we think about texts that are enriching and interesting. Now, we also understand that students have a variety of interests. So it may be that teachers would occasionally want to give students options and choices about reading. We also realize that engagement comes from success, but it also comes from challenge. So you really feel good when you do things that are difficult, like the stretch text, but you also feel good when you get a chance to demonstrate things you know. So we think that there's a lot of ways this practice guide has opportunities for for teachers and educators and parents to make text engaging and interesting and to make the reading for understanding a critical focal point.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Kim. This concludes the Q&A portion. And this presentation contained just a few examples from the practice guide. The full practice guide and additional materials can be accessed on the What Works Clearinghouse website. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, this webinar was recorded. A link to view the recorded webinar will be shared via email to all people who registered for this webinar. The recording will also be available later today on the WWC YouTube channel. If you have additional questions, please submit them via email to the WWC Help Desk at contact.wwc@ed.gov. Thank you. This concludes